My name is Margaret, and this is a story about the day I decided to take control of my life again. It's a story of loss, heartbreak, and the quiet but powerful moment when I realized I had to stop waiting for others to acknowledge my worth. It all started on my husband's death anniversary. My husband, John, had been the love of my life. We built everything together, our home, our family, our dreams. When he passed away 2 years ago from cancer, I felt like the ground had crumbled beneath me. I thought that with time, the pain would ease. But time doesn't always heal the wounds you don't talk about. That day, his anniversary, I waited like I always did, for the phone calls, for the messages. But nothing came. I had a daughter, Amanda, who I'd raised with so much love and dedication. Yet that morning, like all the others before it, she didn't reach out. No phone call, no text. Not even a small gesture to honor her father's memory. I sat in our old kitchen, the one where John and I spent so many mornings together, drinking coffee and planning the days ahead. But now that kitchen felt cold, empty. The sun shone through the window, but it didn't warm the house, nor my heart. I glanced at the clock, waited, and still, nothing. It was as though I was invisible to my own family. I thought about all the years I had spent putting them first. I sacrificed my dreams, my time, and even my happiness to make sure they had everything. I kept our home together, made sure meals were on the table, and tried to always create a warm, loving atmosphere. And in return, when I needed them the most, they were nowhere to be found. I convinced myself that maybe they were just busy. After all, Amanda had a life of her own now, work, her own family. Perhaps they had their own things to deal with. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about being busy. It was about something deeper, something I had ignored for too long. As the hours passed, I found myself feeling more and more isolated. The emptiness inside me grew, and I couldn't help but reflect on the years of sacrifice. I thought about all the times I had been there for them, putting aside my own needs, my own desires. And yet, when the time came to honor the man I had spent my life with, my own daughter, my own flesh and blood, couldn't even take a moment to remember him with me. That night, as the sun set, I was still waiting for a call that never came. I decided to take a walk to clear my head, but as I left the house, something inside me snapped. I didn't want to feel this way anymore. I didn't want to be forgotten. I didn't want to be the woman who gave everything and received nothing in return. I came back inside and sat down on the couch, the same one John and I had sat on for years. I closed my eyes and thought about the love we shared. I thought about how even in the hardest of times, he always made me feel like I mattered. And for the first time in a long while, I realized something important. I mattered too. I couldn't wait any longer for others to see me, to recognize my worth. I needed to do it for myself. I needed to stop expecting others to fill the voids in my heart and start filling them on my own. That night, I made a decision. I was going to honor John's memory in a way that felt right for me. It wasn't going to be about what others did or didn't do. It was going to be about how I wanted to remember him. And I wasn't going to let the silence from my family stop me from celebrating my life and his. Tomorrow, I was going to do something different. I wasn't going to sit alone waiting for people to remember me or John. Instead, I was going to create a space for people who truly mattered, those who loved me, and who I loved in return. I wasn't going to ask for permission. I wasn't going to wait for anyone to come to me. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope. This day, this anniversary, was going to be different. It was time to take back control. The next morning, I woke up with a quiet determination that had been missing for so long. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting long, soft rays across the room, but it didn't feel warm to me. It wasn't like the mornings John and I used to share. There was no laughter, no playful banter as we made breakfast together. It was just me, alone in a house full of memories. I stood by the window, gazing out at the yard where we used to sit together on lazy Sunday afternoons, surrounded by the scent of freshly cut grass and the hum of nature. Our life was built on love, on shared dreams. But now it felt like those dreams had been taken away, like they had been erased. It was strange, really. I had spent so many years building a life around John and our daughter Amanda, believing that as long as I gave everything, I would always be needed. I poured my love into every meal, every holiday, every moment I could create. I gave my all without hesitation, hoping that one day my family would do the same for me. But the truth was undeniable. Amanda hadn't called. The silence in the house was deafening. No one remembered the anniversary of John's death except for me. It wasn't just the pain of losing him that hurt. It was the pain of feeling invisible, of realizing that my efforts and sacrifices had gone unnoticed, unacknowledged. I remember how, when Amanda was younger, she'd run into my arms after a long day, seeking comfort and affection. Those were the days when I was her world, when she needed me as much as I needed her. We had our moments, our small rituals, like making cookies together or walking to the park hand in hand. Those memories were precious to me, and I had believed they would always bind us. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. As Amanda grew older, I began to feel more like a spectator in her life rather than an active participant. She became busy with her job, her social life, and her own little family. And while I understood that life moves on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been left behind. I thought about how years ago I had put my own dreams on hold to build a family, to create a life for Amanda and John. I had worked hard, not just as a mother and wife, but also as a caregiver, always there, always giving. But now I was left in the quiet of this house with nothing but memories and unanswered calls. As the days went on, I tried to convince myself that this was just part of life, that perhaps Amanda was simply too busy to remember. After all, she had her own life now, didn't she? But as I sat in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. I wasn't just being forgotten, I was being erased. That's when I realized something. The love I had given, the years of sacrifices, weren't just gone because my family didn't acknowledge them. They weren't gone because I hadn't been remembered on this one day. The love I had given still mattered, it just needed a new outlet, a new form of expression. I had spent so much of my life pouring my energy into others that I had forgotten how to nurture myself. I had neglected my own needs, my own desires, in the name of duty and love. But now, sitting alone in this house, I knew I couldn't continue this way. I had to start taking care of myself, emotionally, physically, and mentally. I thought about what would make me happy. What would honor John's memory in a way that felt true to who I was now, not just the woman who had lived for others. The answer wasn't about waiting for Amanda or anyone else to reach out. The answer was in my hands. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I would create a space for love, not out of obligation, but because I deserved it. I wouldn't wait for anyone to acknowledge my worth. I would do it for myself. I wasn't just honoring John's memory. I was honoring my own life, my own journey. I thought back to the times when I had celebrated special moments with people who weren't bound by blood, but by love and respect. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had become a part of my life. These were the people who mattered, the ones who understood that family isn't just about genetics. It's about the bonds we form and the love we give. I picked up the phone, a decision already made. I was going to host a small gathering, not a big family affair. No, it was going to be something entirely different. I was going to celebrate John's life with the people who mattered most to me now, the ones who had shown up when I needed them, the ones who truly understood what it meant to love. I made the calls, invited a few close friends, and explained my plan. They were all excited, and I could feel the warmth and comfort of their voices as they agreed to join me. I realized that even though I had been neglected by my family, I was surrounded by people who cared for me deeply. That afternoon, as I prepared for the gathering, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission anymore. I wasn't hoping for a phone call or an apology. I was taking charge of my life and honoring my husband's memory in a way that felt right for me. For the first time in a long time, I felt the stirrings of something I had forgotten. Hope. The hope that I could create my own joy, that I didn't have to wait for anyone to give me permission to live fully. I was no longer waiting in silence. I was moving forward, embracing the love that was all around me, even if it wasn't from the people I had once expected it from. I was ready to celebrate my life, my journey, and the love I still carried for John. I didn't need to be remembered by anyone else. I remembered myself. And so the evening arrived. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was filled with warmth, laughter, and love. As I sat with friends, sharing stories and memories, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of belonging. For the first time in a while, I realized that my worth was never tied to others' recognition of me. It had always been inside me. The silence I once feared had become my ally. It gave me space to find myself again. And in that silence, I found my voice. The days after that quiet, reflective anniversary morning felt like a turning point for me. There was a shift inside, a realization that I no longer had to wait for someone else to decide how I should feel or what I should do. For so long, I had lived for others, made sure they were happy, made sure the family was whole, even at the expense of my own needs. But that day, I realized I had been letting my life pass me by waiting for validation from people who, at that moment, didn't even seem to notice I was missing. As the week went on, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had decided to do. I had always placed importance on family, on the idea that blood was thicker than water. I had spent so many years holding onto that belief, thinking that one day all the sacrifices I had made would come back to me, that they would somehow be appreciated. But I was wrong. The truth was, my worth was not tied to their recognition, and it never had been. The decision to host a gathering, a celebration really, was about something deeper than just remembering John. It was about claiming a new chapter for myself, where I didn't have to shrink in the background, where I wasn't going to be forgotten, sidelined, or silenced anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about honoring John's memory. It was about honoring myself. I made a list of people who had been there for me, who had loved me, even if they weren't part of my bloodline. There was Jessica, my neighbor, who had shown up with soup and tea when John was first diagnosed, who had listened to me cry and offered comfort without expecting anything in return. Then there was Sarah, my longtime friend from the book club, who had called every week just to check in after John passed. And finally, there was Eddie, a colleague from work who had become more of a brother to me in the last few years than any family member had ever been. He always reminded me to take care of myself, even when I didn't want to. I knew that this gathering would be different. It wasn't going to be about pretending to be okay when I wasn't. It wasn't going to be about pretending that everything was perfect when the truth was I had been silently bearing the weight of loneliness for far too long. This wasn't going to be a family event. It was going to be a celebration of love, of the people who had stuck by me through thick and thin, even when it wasn't easy. I started planning the event carefully. It wasn't going to be some grand, expensive gathering. It was going to be simple, intimate, and above all, real. I wanted to create an atmosphere where people could truly connect, where we could celebrate John's life together in a way that felt natural and authentic to the life we had shared. There would be no formality, no pretense, just good food, music, and honest conversations. The menu was simple, comfort food, the kind John used to love. I planned to make his favorite casserole, roast chicken, and maybe even his famous apple pie, the one that always made the whole house smell like autumn. I wanted everything to feel familiar, like the nights we used to spend in the kitchen together, preparing meals and laughing over silly stories. It was going to be a celebration of the little things, the things that really mattered. I also planned to invite a few of the neighbors, people who I knew had been through their own struggles. We might not have been family by blood, but we were family by circumstance, by the shared experiences of life and loss. We understood each other in ways that my biological family never quite could. When I made the calls, I couldn't help but smile. It was as though I had rediscovered something that I had lost long ago. The joy of connecting with people who truly cared. They were excited, and they understood why I was doing this. There was no judgment, no questioning why I wasn't inviting my daughter or other family members. There was only understanding and warmth, and that felt better than I could have imagined. The morning of the gathering arrived, and as I prepared the house, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It wasn't the same peace that comes from avoiding conflict or pretending everything is fine. No, This peace came from the knowledge that I was doing something for myself, that I was taking charge of my own happiness. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval anymore. As the guests began to arrive, I felt a sense of relief, as though the weight of the past few years had finally begun to lift. Each person who walked through the door brought with them a sense of comfort, of love, of understanding. We all shared stories, some about John, some about our own lives, and some about the challenges we had all faced. But the thing that stood out the most was the connection. The love wasn't conditional, and it wasn't based on blood. It was based on years of shared experience, on showing up for each other in times of need. I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about big gestures, grand speeches, or elaborate displays of affection. It was about the quiet moments, the soft laughter, the shared stories, the simple act of being present. These people, my chosen family, understood me in a way that was deeper than anything I had ever experienced before. And in that moment, as I looked around the room at the faces of people who had chosen to be there, who had chosen to honor John's memory and my own, I realized something important. I didn't need my biological family to validate my worth. I didn't need their acknowledgement to know that I had made a difference, that my life had mattered. These people, these friends, were proof of that. The gathering was small, but it was filled with love. There was no feeling of being overlooked, no silent disappointment. It was just a group of people who understood that family is not just about blood. It's about who shows up for you when you need them most. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a family that truly saw me. As the evening went on, I felt a warmth in my heart that I hadn't felt in ages. I realized that in my quest to be loved and appreciated, I had been overlooking the love that was already right in front of me. I didn't need to be defined by my relationship with Amanda or anyone else in my biological family. I was defined by the love I gave, by the people who chose to love me in return, and by the strength I had to keep going, no matter the circumstances. That night, as I sat surrounded by friends and laughter, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer the woman waiting for others to notice her. I was the woman who had taken control, who had created her own joy, who had finally stopped waiting for a love that didn't come and had instead embraced the love that was already there. It wasn't just a celebration of John's life. It was a celebration of my own life, of my worth, and of the people who truly mattered. And that felt like the best gift I could ever give myself. The night of the gathering was one I would remember for years to come. The air in the house felt different, lighter, filled with laughter, shared memories, and warmth, not the cold emptiness I had grown used to. I hadn't expected it to be easy, but as the evening unfolded, I found myself letting go of old expectations, embracing the new tradition I had decided to create. This wasn't about what had been, or what I had been waiting for. It was about now. And now, I was making the space for myself to be seen, to be loved, and to truly live. As I moved around the room, I couldn't help but notice the simple joy of being surrounded by people who had chosen to be here. These were the ones who knew what it meant to truly love, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely cared. These were the people who, when life got tough, had stepped up without hesitation, showing me that family wasn't just about blood. It was about those who show up, no questions asked. I glanced at the table, the one I had set with care. Nothing too extravagant, but simple and heartfelt. There were plates of roasted chicken, the casserole I had spent hours preparing, and the apple pie, golden and warm, just as John had liked it. Every dish was a small tribute to him, to us, to the life we had built together. As I looked around at the faces of those who had come, I realized that, in a way, this was just as meaningful as any family celebration I had imagined. I caught Sarah, my friend from the book club, talking animatedly with Jessica, the neighbor who had been my lifeline when things got tough. They were laughing, sharing stories about their own lives, and in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of connection. It wasn't forced or fabricated. It was genuine, as natural as the bond one had once shared with my own family. These were the people who understood what it meant to support each other through thick and thin, who knew the value of showing up. Eddie, the colleague who had become a good friend, was standing in the corner by the window, telling a funny story about his latest adventures in home renovation. I could see the sparkle in his eyes as he spoke, and I realized how much I had missed these moments of lightness. It was so easy to get bogged down in the heaviness of life, to focus on what was missing. But tonight, there was nothing missing. I was surrounded by people who loved me, who celebrated me just as I was, and that felt like enough. I couldn't help but smile as the evening went on. It wasn't grandiose or filled with showy displays of affection, but it was real. There were no pretensions, no silent judgments, just the comfort of knowing that, for once, I wasn't the one being overlooked. I wasn't invisible. I was present, and I mattered. As the evening wore on, I started to see how my decision to create this new tradition was changing me. It wasn't just about honoring John's memory. It was about honoring myself. For so long, I had allowed my identity to be wrapped up in what others thought of me. I had let my worth be dictated by whether my family recognized my efforts, whether Amanda would pick up the phone, whether anyone would remember the sacrifices I had made. But that night, I realized something fundamental. My worth was never dependent on anyone else's recognition. It was always inherent inside me, waiting for me to see it. I looked around the room, and my heart swelled with gratitude. The people who were here, my chosen family, had given me something that no one else had. They had given me a sense of belonging, a space where I could be myself without needing to prove anything. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being loved, accepted, and appreciated for the person I had always been. As the evening came to a close, I found myself feeling content, something I hadn't felt in so long. I realized that, for the first time in years, I was no longer trying to fit into a mold that didn't serve me. I wasn't trying to earn affection or approval from people who didn't even see me for who I truly was. I was no longer seeking validation from my family or anyone else. I had found something deeper, something more fulfilling, the understanding that I was worthy of love and respect, not because of what I gave, but simply because I existed. The last of my guests trickled out, leaving me with the soft glow of the lamps and the lingering warmth of their presence. I stood by the door feeling a deep sense of peace, and as I closed it behind them, I knew something had shifted inside me. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't waiting for Amanda to call, for my family to show up, or for anyone to recognize my value. I had taken control of my life. I walked back into the living room, now quiet and still, and sat down on the couch. The house felt different now, full, even in its silence. And for the first time in a long while, I realized that the silence wasn't something to be afraid of. It wasn't a sign of neglect. It was space. It was a space where I could breathe, where I could be free to live on my own terms without anyone else's expectations. I wasn't invisible anymore. As I sat there, I reflected on what I had created. This wasn't just a one-time gathering. This was the beginning of a new tradition, one where I would celebrate the love I had for myself and for those who had been there for me. And I wasn't going to stop. Tomorrow, I would keep moving forward, carving out more moments like this, simple, genuine, and filled with love. No longer waiting for anyone to show up. Instead, I was choosing to create the space where I could feel loved, where I could be seen, where I could truly live. I had created something beautiful, something that was all my own. And for the first time in years, I knew I was going to be okay. The days that followed the gathering were a blur of contentment. I couldn't help but smile as I went about my usual routine, a quiet joy lingering in the background of everything I did. It wasn't the loud kind of happiness that demands attention. It was more subtle, a peace that I hadn't felt in years. It was as though something had shifted inside me, an internal shift that I couldn't quite explain, but one that made every part of my life feel brighter, more grounded. For so long, I had been waiting for something, anything, to change. I had wanted my family to step up, to see me for who I was. I had wanted my daughter, Amanda, to remember how much I had given for her, to take a moment to acknowledge the sacrifices I made for her and for our family. But in the wake of that gathering, I realized something profound. I had been waiting for others to change, but all along, the power to change my life was within me. The beauty of that night wasn't just in the laughter or the heartfelt conversations. It was in the realization that I had reclaimed something vital. I had taken the power back, not from Amanda or my family, but from the silence I had allowed to rule my life. That silence had once made me feel invisible, but now it was different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was my space, my opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to take charge of what I wanted in life. The more I thought about it, the more I saw how many moments I had missed over the years, simply because I had been so focused on what wasn't happening. I had spent so much time dwelling on my family's neglect, wondering why they couldn't see me, that I had overlooked all the moments of connection and joy that were right in front of me. I remember a conversation I had with Sarah, one of my friends from the gathering, a few days after the event. She called to check in, asking how I was doing. Her voice was warm, comforting, but there was something else in her tone, a new sense of recognition, almost as if she saw me in a way she hadn't before. "How are you holding up?" she asked, and I could hear the genuine care in her voice. "I'm good," I replied, a small laugh escaping me. "Better than I've been in a long time." "Good to hear. You deserve to feel like that," she said. "I saw something in you that night, something I think you've been missing for a while." I paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. What had she seen in me? What had I been missing? I had to think for a second before answering. I guess I've been waiting for someone else to show up to fill the spaces in my life. But the truth is, I've always had everything I needed inside me. I just needed to realize it. She was quiet for a moment, then replied, "That's powerful, Margaret. I'm proud of you." And in that moment, I realized something else. It wasn't just about me reclaiming my joy. It was about showing others that it's possible to reclaim your life, your dignity, and your peace. No matter how old you are, no matter how many years you spent waiting for others to acknowledge your worth. The gathering had opened a door for me, a door I hadn't even known was there. It led to a place of self-respect, self-love, and independence. The more I embraced that, the more I saw the world around me differently. I began to notice the small things, the things that had always been there, but that I had overlooked in the chaos of trying to please others. A friendly smile from a neighbor as we passed by on the street. A phone call from an old friend, just to catch up. Little moments of connection that had once felt insignificant, but now felt like precious gifts. One afternoon, I ran into Jessica, the neighbor who had come to the gathering, while I was out for a walk. She was sitting on her porch, reading a book, her dog curled up at her feet. When she saw me, she waved me over. "I was hoping you'd stop by," she said with a smile. "How are you? How's the house after the party?" I took a seat beside her, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. "It's been really good. I'm doing well. More than I expected, actually." Jessica raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I think I've finally realized something," I said, looking down at my hands for a moment. "I've spent so many years waiting for someone else to see me, to appreciate what I've done. But the truth is, I don't need that validation. I've always been enough. I've just had to believe that." She nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Believing you're enough, even when no one else seems to notice. I used to think that if I did enough, if I gave enough, they'd see me. But now, I understand that I don't have to keep giving pieces of myself away just to be loved. I've already done enough, and I deserve love, peace, and happiness on my own terms." Jessica smiled and patted my hand gently. "I'm proud of you, Margaret. You've always been enough. I'm glad you finally see it too." That afternoon, as I walked back to my house, I felt a new kind of lightness. There was no longing for approval, no ache of wanting to be seen by those who had failed to see me for so long. I had already given everything I could to my family, and now I was giving something to myself. I was taking the time to truly see myself, to recognize my worth, and to honor it. And the more I allowed myself to do that, the more I realized something else. I was no longer defined by what I did for others. I was defined by who I was. The joy I felt in those small moments, the quiet comfort of being understood by friends who cared, was more fulfilling than anything I had ever expected from my family. They may not have noticed my sacrifices, they may have turned away when I needed them the most, but in this newfound space, I wasn't seeking their approval anymore. I had created my own peace, my own happiness. As I settled into this new reality, I started to feel stronger. The power of reclaiming my worth wasn't about grand gestures or seeking revenge on those who had hurt me. It was about taking back the pieces of myself that I had given away and choosing to protect them, to honor them. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was important. I knew it now. I had always known it. And that was enough. The joy of reclaimed moments wasn't about waiting for others. It was about choosing to be happy no matter what. The weeks following the gathering continued to feel different. I had started this journey unsure of what would come, but now there was no turning back. Something had shifted deep within me. The life I had been waiting for, the one filled with recognition, understanding, and appreciation from my family, was never going to come in the way I had imagined. But the life I was building for myself, the one I had started to carve out with my own hands, was full of promise. And that promise was enough. I remember one morning, about a month after the party, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reflecting on everything that had changed. The sun streamed through the window, casting soft golden rays over the table, and as I looked at the empty chairs around me, I felt a sense of contentment that was almost foreign. It wasn't the overwhelming joy of a life that was perfect. It was quieter, more peaceful. The kind of peace that comes from accepting yourself fully, from understanding that your worth doesn't come from how others perceive you, but from how you see yourself. I had spent so much of my life waiting for someone to acknowledge what I did, to thank me for the years of sacrifices I had made, for the love I had given. But now I saw it for what it was. I had been waiting for permission to live, to claim my own space, my own joy, and my own voice. And now, finally, I had stopped waiting. I had stepped into my own power. It wasn't about being angry anymore. I had spent so many years being angry, feeling overlooked, abandoned, and unloved by the very people I had given everything for. But as the weeks passed, I realized that anger wasn't doing anything for me. It wasn't serving me. It was only keeping me tethered to the past, to the hurt, to the people who had failed me. I wasn't going to let my family define me any longer. I wasn't going to keep hoping they would see my worth, because the truth was, I had been blind to it for so long. I had let their neglect shape my reality, and now I was choosing to create a new one. A reality where I was in control, where I didn't have to rely on anyone else for validation. One evening, I received a call from Amanda. It was the first time she had reached out to me since the gathering. My heart fluttered in my chest as I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to continue my silence, but something told me this was a moment that needed to be addressed. I answered the phone. Mom. Her voice sounded softer than I remembered, almost fragile. I've been thinking a lot lately. I'm sorry for how I treated you, for not being there when you needed me. I don't know where to begin. I could feel my breath catch in my chest. For so long, I had waited for this moment, the apology, the recognition. I had imagined this conversation 1,000 times, played it out in my head. But in that moment, as I stood in the kitchen listening to her voice, I realized something. I didn't need the apology anymore. I didn't need her to fix what had been broken, because I had already begun to fix it myself. I appreciate you saying that, Amanda, I said, my voice steady. But I need you to understand something. What I needed wasn't an apology. What I needed was to stop being invisible. I needed to see my own worth and stop waiting for someone else to see it. I've learned that I don't need anyone's approval to be happy. There was a silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her processing my words. I think I understand what you mean, she finally said. I've been so caught up in my own life that I didn't even realize how much you were giving, how much you were sacrificing. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. I took a deep breath. It's okay, Amanda. I've spent so many years giving everything, and it's time I started giving to myself. I'm learning to take care of me now. I hope you can understand that. She didn't respond right away, but I could feel the weight of the conversation settling between us. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking for anything from her. I wasn't waiting for her to fill the void. I was simply being honest about what I needed, about what I had come to realize I mattered, not because of what I did for others, but because of who I was, and that was enough. We talked for a while longer, and while I wasn't sure what the future of our relationship would look like, I felt something inside me shift. The conversation wasn't about blame or guilt. It wasn't about her making up for lost time or me holding on to past hurts. It was about mutual understanding, about setting boundaries, and about respecting each other's journeys. I wasn't looking for perfection from her, and I didn't need to fix the broken pieces of our past. I had come to realize that sometimes it's not about fixing everything. It's about accepting things as they are and choosing to move forward in the healthiest way possible for both of us. As the days went by, I focused more on my own well-being. I began taking walks in the park again, something I hadn't done in years. I started visiting local art galleries, something I had always loved but had put off for too long. I even picked up painting again, something that had been a passion of mine long, before I put it aside for the sake of family. I created, not for anyone's approval, but for the joy it brought me. I was rediscovering pieces of myself I had hidden away for too long. And in those moments, as I sat in front of a canvas, brush in hand, I realized something truly profound. The power of reclaiming your worth isn't in waiting for others to see it. It's in seeing it for yourself. I didn't need validation from anyone. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was important, because I already knew. And that knowledge was the most freeing thing I had ever experienced. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. The road to healing and self-empowerment wasn't going to be a straight line, but I was ready for it. I was stronger than I had ever been, because I had stopped waiting for someone else to define me. I had started defining myself. I was no longer the woman sitting in the silence, hoping for recognition. I was the woman who had learned to speak up for herself, to embrace her worth, and to live her life on her own terms. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could ever give myself. In the weeks following my conversation with Amanda, I began to reflect more deeply on what family really meant to me, and what I had always expected from it. For so many years, I had defined myself by my role in the family. I was the mother, the caregiver, the one who kept everything together. I expected love, respect, and appreciation in return for all that I had given. But time and time again, it seemed those expectations had gone unmet. I was left wondering why my love and sacrifices weren't reciprocated. Now, with the clarity I had gained, I could see that part of the problem was that I had allowed those expectations to dictate how I felt about myself. I had believed that my worth was tied to how much I gave, how much I did for others. But in doing so, I had unknowingly placed myself in a position of dependency on their approval, their gratitude, their acknowledgement. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my family, as I had known it, wasn't the place where I could truly be seen. I loved them deeply, of course, and I had always tried to be there for them. But the truth was, they hadn't been able to do the same for me in the way I had hoped. It wasn't just about what had happened with Amanda. It was the years of little things, the missed birthdays, the forgotten anniversaries, the times I had extended myself and been met with indifference, or, worse, dismissal. It was the countless times I had been made to feel like a second-class citizen in my own home, my own family. The more I looked at it, the more I saw that I had been undervalued, not by others, but by myself. I wasn't angry anymore, though. That was the biggest difference. I had spent so many years feeling bitter about how I had been treated, but I had come to understand something important. I couldn't change them. I couldn't make them care in the way I wanted them to. But I could change how I viewed the situation. I could choose not to let their actions dictate how I felt about myself. I could choose to stop waiting for them to fill the emotional gaps in my life and start filling them myself. And so I began to ask myself a difficult question. What did I really need from my family, and how could I stop expecting it from them? The truth was, what I needed wasn't just a phone call on special occasions or a thank you for all I had done. What I needed more than anything was respect. Respect for the person I had become, for the boundaries I was now setting, and for the life I was choosing to live on my own terms. That meant I needed to redefine my relationship with my family. I needed to create space for myself, for my needs, and for my happiness. It wasn't about cutting them off or casting them aside. It was about shifting the dynamics, creating a relationship that was based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than the old patterns of sacrifice and expectation. I decided to have another conversation with Amanda. This time, it wasn't about apologies. It wasn't about explaining myself or defending my actions. It was about setting boundaries. It was about showing her and myself that I was no longer the woman who would give and give without receiving the respect I deserved. Mom. Amanda's voice was soft when she called me a few days after our last conversation. Can we talk? Oh, of course, I replied, feeling my heart rate pick up slightly. I knew this conversation was important. She asked if we could meet in person, and I agreed. When I arrived at the small cafe where we had decided to meet, I couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and anticipation. It had been years since we'd really talked in person, just the two of us, without any distractions. When she walked in, I saw the same familiar face. My daughter, yes, but also a woman who had grown and changed in ways I hadn't fully realized. She had her own life now, her own struggles, and I knew that it wasn't easy for her either. We exchanged small pleasantries before sitting down, and I could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. I've been thinking a lot, Amanda said, her eyes searching mine, about what you said last time we talked, about how you've been feeling about everything. I know I haven't been there the way I should have been, and I want to change that. I nodded, feeling the lump in my throat. It wasn't easy hearing those words from her, and yet it was exactly what I needed to hear. But even in that moment, I knew that I wasn't going to let her apology or her desire to change dictate what happened next. It was time for me to speak up. I appreciate you saying that, Amanda, I said carefully, but I need you to understand that this is about more than just the past. It's about what I need from you now, moving forward. I need respect. I need you to see me not just as your mother who has always been there for you, but as a woman who has lived a life, who has needs and wants of her own. And I need you to respect the boundaries I'm setting. She looked at me, her expression softening. I understand, she said quietly. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that. I know you are, I said, my voice steady. But this isn't just about apologies anymore. It's about understanding that I've spent a lifetime taking care of everyone else, and now it's my time to take care of myself. That means I can't be the person you've always turned to without getting something in return. I need to feel like I'm seen, like I'm valued, not just as a mother, but as an individual. The conversation didn't end with a resolution, nor did it end with everything magically falling into place. But it was a start to a new way of relating to each other, where the patterns of neglect and unspoken expectations no longer held sway over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for her or anyone else to suddenly become the person I wanted them to be. I had finally taken control of my own narrative, and that meant understanding that I couldn't change anyone but myself. The more I reflected on this conversation, the more I realized that I was no longer bound by the old expectations of what a family should look like. I wasn't looking for perfection. I wasn't asking for everything to be fixed, but I was asking for respect, for love, and for boundaries that honored who I had become. The power of reclaiming my worth was not just in the act of standing up for myself. It was in the realization that I had the ability to rewrite the rules, to change the dynamics, and to protect the peace I had worked so hard to build. And that peace wasn't just for me. It was for my family too. Because in the end, I had learned that true love isn't about endless sacrifice. It's about mutual respect, understanding, and allowing each other to grow. As I left the cafe that day, I felt a sense of relief. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I was walking it on my own terms. I wasn't waiting for others to validate my choices or my worth. I had already done that for myself. The conversation with Amanda had been an important step in reclaiming my own power, but it was just one part of a larger journey. As I continued to embrace this new chapter of my life, I realized something else that needed attention: my financial independence. For most of my life, I had tied my sense of purpose and self-worth to my family. I had given everything emotionally, physically, and financially to support them. But in doing so, I had unknowingly placed myself in a position where I was dependent on others, on my family, for validation and even survival. Now, with the new clarity I had gained, I knew that this too had to change. I needed to take control of my finances, to stop relying on the notion that family would always be there to help me when I needed it. I needed to become financially independent, not just for security, but as a means to affirm my self-worth and my ability to create the life I wanted without waiting for anyone else's approval. For years, I had put my family first. I took on extra work when we needed money, sacrificed my own wants and needs to make sure there was always enough for everyone else. But somewhere along the way, I had neglected my own financial well-being. It wasn't that I had been irresponsible. On the contrary, I had always been careful with my money. But I had prioritized everyone else's needs above my own, not realizing that I was slowly eroding my own financial freedom. I decided to make a change. The first step was simple. I started taking a hard look at my finances. I had always kept a budget, but I had never really owned it. I had always thought of money as something that came and went, never fully taking control of it as I should have. I sat down one evening with a notebook and began to review my accounts, my savings, my debts, my assets, and for the first time, I wasn't just looking at the numbers. I was seeing them for what they really were, a tool that I could use to shape my future, my independence, my security. As I went through everything, I realized that I had assets I hadn't been fully utilizing. A small savings account I had been too afraid to dip into, some life insurance policies that could be cashed out, and a modest investment portfolio that had been stagnant for years. These weren't huge amounts, but they were enough to start giving me a sense of control over my future. I had the power to change my financial situation, to stop waiting for someone else to fix things, or to bail me out when times were tough. I made a list of what needed to be done. Pay down some debt, start putting money into a retirement account, and most importantly, stop giving away money without regard for my own future. I knew that my next step was not just about making sure I had enough money to get by, but about building a future where I could thrive on my own terms. One of the first actions I took was to set up a meeting with a financial advisor. I had always been hesitant about asking for help in that area, thinking I could figure it out on my own. But I realized that, just like in other parts of my life, I needed to learn from the experts. I needed to equip myself with the knowledge that would help me make sound financial decisions for my future. The advisor was patient and kind, guiding me through the process of reviewing my current financial situation and mapping out a strategy for growth. I was surprised at how empowering it felt to have a plan in place, to see that I had the ability to make choices that could shape my future. It wasn't just about making money. It was about creating a life of financial freedom, where I wasn't dependent on anyone else's whims or decisions. But it wasn't just about the numbers. The more I worked with my advisor, the more I realized that my financial independence was tied to something deeper, my sense of self-worth. For so long, I had defined myself by what I could give to others, by how much I sacrificed, how much I did for my family. I had never really thought about what I needed, about what was mine. I had been so focused on making sure others were taken care of that I had neglected my own needs, including my financial well-being. As I began to set up savings plans and create budgets for the future, I started to see how this was about more than just money. It was about respect. Respect for my own needs, my own desires, and my own worth. I had spent too many years feeling like my value was tied to how much I could give, and now I was learning that I had value because of who I was. I was learning to put myself first, to say no when I needed to, and to stop overextending myself for people who didn't appreciate it. I also began to reframe my relationship with money. I used to think of it as a tool to keep everyone else happy. But now I saw it as something I could use to create a future where I could be happy, where I could live without fear of being financially vulnerable. I stopped seeing money as a source of guilt or stress, and instead started seeing it as a source of empowerment. It was the key to my independence, to my freedom. One of the hardest lessons was learning to set financial boundaries. For years, I had been the one who always said yes when someone needed help. Whether it was a loan to a family member, a gift for a friend, or just putting others' needs ahead of mine, I had always felt guilty when I said no. But now, I knew that I couldn't keep giving without taking care of myself first. I learned to say no without guilt. I learned to say, I need this for myself, and to trust that my worth wasn't tied to how much I could give to others. It wasn't easy at first. I had spent so long putting others first that it felt uncomfortable, to prioritize my own financial needs. But the more I practiced, the easier it became, and the more empowered I felt. I began to take small steps, paying down debt, saving more, investing in my future. Each step was a reminder that I was in control, that I had the power to shape my future the way I wanted. It wasn't about becoming rich or living a life of luxury. It was about creating a life of stability, security, and freedom. By the time I sat down to review my finances again a few months later, I saw just how far I had come. Not just financially, but emotionally. I had taken charge of my life in a way I had never thought possible. I was no longer waiting for someone else to take care of me. I had learned that my financial well-being wasn't just about numbers. It was about respecting myself enough to make sure I was taken care of, too. The financial independence I was building was just one more piece of the puzzle. It was a reminder that, while family may always have its ups and downs, I had the power to shape my life the way I wanted. I wasn't just living for others anymore. I was living for me. And that was the most freeing thing of all. As I continued to reclaim my life, I realized that part of my journey involved confronting the past, those moments that had shaped me into who I was, both the good and the painful. It was about taking the broken pieces of my life, not to fix them, but to accept them as part of my story. And through that acceptance, I could rewrite my future. It wasn't just about the external changes I was making, rebuilding my financial independence, setting boundaries with my family, learning to value myself. It was about healing the internal wounds that I had buried for years, the wounds that had caused me to feel small, unimportant, and unseen. I had spent so much of my life trying to prove my worth to others, to gain their approval, that I had forgotten to look inward. I had forgotten to validate myself. The first step in confronting my past came when I decided to go through some old boxes in the attic. These boxes were filled with photographs, letters, and mementos from a time long gone. When I was younger, when John and I were raising our children, when everything felt so full of promise. But as I dusted off the old boxes and opened them, I was met with a strange feeling. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was something more. It was a sense of loss, of grief, of understanding how much of my life had been defined by other people's expectations. There were pictures of John and me on our honeymoon, looking young and full of hope. There were letters from my mother, written in her tidy script, filled with advice that had once seemed so wise but now felt distant, as if they were from a different lifetime. And there were countless photos of Amanda when she was little, when I had been everything to her. Seeing those moments of happiness reminded me of the dreams I had once had for myself, the hopes I had nurtured quietly in my heart, only to set them aside in the name of family, duty, and sacrifice. I took the time to really look at those pictures. I saw the woman I had been, the young woman full of hope, excitement, and dreams for the future. I remembered the sacrifices I made, the nights I stayed up late, working to keep everything together, to ensure everyone else had what they needed. And while I had no regrets about those years, I also saw how much I had given up, how much I had neglected my own needs, my own desires. But as I looked at the photos of John and me, I also saw something else. I saw the love that had once burned brightly, the partnership that had given me so much joy. And it hit me like a wave. I hadn't just lost him when he passed. I had lost myself. I had become so focused on being the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect caregiver, that I had forgotten who I was without those roles. That realization hit me hard, but it was also liberating. It was the first time I truly understood that the woman I had been all those years, the one who had given everything to others, who had constantly poured from an empty cup, wasn't the only version of me. I had the power to become something else. I had the power to reclaim the woman I had been before life's responsibilities took over, to honor the parts of myself that I had buried in the name of family. As I sorted through the boxes, I found something that surprised me, an old journal, one I had kept in my younger years. It was filled with sketches, dreams, and thoughts that I hadn't thought about in ages. One entry stood out to me. It was a passage where I had written about my dreams of traveling, of pursuing my passion for art, of doing something just for myself. I had forgotten that I had those dreams. I had buried them under layers of obligations, responsibilities, and the quiet belief that my worth was defined by how much I could give to others. Reading that journal was like meeting a stranger. It was like meeting the woman I used to be, the woman who had dreams, who had desires that went beyond taking care of everyone else. The woman who had once believed that her life could be her own, full of adventure and fulfillment. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel that spark again. I allowed myself to dream, even if those dreams seemed far-fetched. It wasn't too late to pursue them. It wasn't too late to become the woman I had once hoped to be. I wasn't just a mother, a wife, a caregiver. I was Margaret. And Margaret had a right to live a life that was true to her own needs, her own desires. In that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait anymore. I wasn't going to let my past define me. I wasn't going to let the mistakes or regrets of the past hold me back from embracing the future I deserved. The future where I could finally step into the fullness of who I was, a woman who had given so much but was ready to take something back for herself. The next day, I took another step toward confronting my past and rewriting my future. I enrolled in a painting class at the local community center. It was something I had always wanted to do, but had never found the time for. I didn't know where it would lead or what I would create, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was doing something for me. I was finally honoring the woman I had left behind for so many years. As I walked to the community center, feeling a little nervous, but excited, I thought about how far I had come. I was no longer the woman who waited for her family to recognize her worth. I wasn't the woman who lived in the shadow of others' expectations. I was reclaiming my past, confronting the pieces of myself I had hidden away, and rewriting my future. And this time, I was writing it with a pen that was entirely mine. When I arrived at the class, I felt a rush of anticipation. I wasn't just stepping into a room full of people. I was stepping into a new chapter of my life. One where I could finally pursue my own happiness without guilt, without waiting for anyone else to give me permission. It was liberating and it felt like freedom. And for the first time in so long, I felt like I was truly starting to live again. Not for anyone else, not because of the roles I had played, but for me. And that, I realized, was the most powerful transformation of all. As I continued down this path of self-discovery and empowerment, I began to realize that the journey I had been on wasn't just about confronting my past or taking control of my finances. It wasn't just about setting boundaries with my family or reclaiming lost dreams. It was about something much deeper, living for myself. For so many years, I had lived for others, my husband, my children, my family. I had shaped my identity around being needed, around being the one who always gave, always sacrificed, and always put others first. But in doing so, I had forgotten something crucial. I was worthy of living for me too. The more I leaned into this new way of thinking, the more I felt my life transform. It wasn't dramatic or instantaneous, but it was real. Every decision I made from that point on felt like a choice I was making for my own well-being, for my own happiness, and for the future I had long neglected. It was a quiet rebellion against the patterns that had once controlled my life. I remember one evening, a few months after enrolling in that painting class, sitting in my living room, a canvas in front of me, and just taking it all in. I had spent so many years creating for others, caring for my family, holding everything together, that I had forgotten how to create for myself. But now I was doing it. I was finally filling the space in my life that I had once filled only with the needs of others. I was painting not because I needed to please anyone, but because I wanted to. That evening, as I picked up my brush and started to paint, something clicked inside me. I realized that I had finally found what I had been searching for, a life that was truly my own. Not a life that was defined by the needs or expectations of others, but a life that reflected my own desires, passions, and worth. A life where I didn't have to apologize for wanting more, for taking up space, or for choosing my own happiness. I thought about the years I had spent waiting for recognition, waiting for someone to acknowledge all that I had done. But I no longer needed that recognition. I didn't need anyone's approval to know that I was enough. I had spent too many years believing my worth was tied to how much I gave, to how much I sacrificed. But now, I understood that my worth was inherent. I was valuable simply because I existed. The transformation wasn't just about my relationship with my family or my finances. It was about understanding that I had a right to live fully, to enjoy life on my own terms, and to prioritize my own happiness. I no longer measured my value by how much I could do for others. I measured it by the love I gave myself, by the choices I made, and by the life I was actively creating. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I felt guilty for putting myself first, when I thought about the years I had spent giving everything to others without receiving much in return. But in those moments, I reminded myself of something I had come to know deeply. I deserved to take care of myself. I deserved joy, freedom, and peace. And I had the right to build a life where those things weren't optional, they were essential. As I looked around my home, I realized that my life had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined a year ago. It wasn't about the material things or external achievements. It was about the quiet joy of knowing that I was living my truth. I had created a space for myself, a space where I could finally be seen, not as a mother, a wife, or a caregiver, but as Margaret, as me. The phone calls from Amanda had become more frequent. There were still moments of tension, moments when our old patterns threatened to resurface. But this time, I wasn't allowing them to define me. I listened, I set my boundaries, and I spoke my truth. And I no longer feared that my happiness would be taken away. As the months passed, I learned to navigate this new reality. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't always easy. There were still challenges, still moments when I had to remind myself that I had the power to choose how I wanted to live. But every day I felt stronger. Every day, I embraced my independence a little more, trusting that the life I was building was exactly the one I deserved. And then one day it hit me. I was no longer waiting. I was no longer waiting for anyone's validation. I wasn't waiting for a phone call, for an apology, or for anyone to tell me that I mattered. I had already validated myself. I had already given myself the permission to live fully. That was the ultimate freedom. The last piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. I was living for myself, and in that, I found a happiness and peace that I had been chasing for years. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was quiet, deep, and peaceful. It was the joy of knowing that I had taken control of my life and created the future I had always dreamed of. This journey had been long, and it hadn't been easy. There had been heartache, moments of doubt, and plenty of tears. But each step had brought me closer to the woman I was always meant to be. A woman who knew her worth, who set her own boundaries, who embraced her own happiness without guilt. As I sat there, looking at the painting I had just finished, I smiled. The future was mine to create, and I was no longer waiting for anyone to tell me what it should look like. I had already begun painting it, one brushstroke at a time. And for the first time in my life, I was living exactly the way I was always meant to for me.